The Valley of the Kings, the year 1903 since the Nativity of Christ. The merciless Egyptian sun flooded the limestone cliffs with blinding light, turning the ravine into a scorching furnace. The air, thick with dust and heat, shimmered, and in this vibrating silence it seemed one could hear the whispers of millennia. Here, in this sun-baked necropolis where the earth held the secrets of Egypt's greatest rulers, a young and obsessed English archaeologist named Howard Carter was conducting his search. He was not looking for just another tomb. He was searching for a ghost, almost erased from the annals of history, the trace of a ruler whose existence was a mystery, shrouded in a conspiracy of silence. Years earlier, workers clearing rock debris at the foot of the magnificent temple at Deir el-Bahari had stumbled upon something astonishing. It was a whole dump, but not of ordinary rubbish. From beneath the sand and rubble, they unearthed thousands of fragments of statues carved from the finest stone. All of them depicted the same pharaoh in traditional royal attire, the ritual Nemes headdress and the false beard that was a symbol of divine power. But something was wrong. Every statue, every stele, every sphinx had been methodically, with cold fury, smashed to pieces. The faces were chiseled off. The names in the cartouches were scraped away. This was not the work of common robbers searching for gold. This was the work of executioners whose tools were not swords but hammers and chisels. It was a ritual murder of memory, an attempt to tear a page from the book of eternity to condemn a soul to oblivion. The name they were trying to destroy was Hatshepsut, and the most astonishing thing was that beneath the erased features of a male pharaoh, the delicate contours of a female face emerged. This was a woman who dared to rule as a king, a woman who assumed the full measure of sacred authority in a world where order, or ma'at, seemed to have permanently assigned this role to men. Howard Carter, guided by barely perceptible clues and his incredible intuition, finally found what he was looking for. He discovered a modest, almost inconspicuous entrance to a tomb designated as Tomb 20 in the Valley of the Kings. When he entered, he found not mountains of gold, but only 2 sarcophagi in an atmosphere of desecrated peace. One sarcophagus belonged to her father, the great conqueror Thutmose I. The other, altered and enlarged, was intended for her. But her mummy was gone. The mystery only deepened. Who was this incredible woman whose rise to power broke all traditions? How did she manage to hold the throne for almost 22 years in an era that became a golden age of peace and prosperity? And what dark force, what insatiable hatred or cold political calculation drove her successors to try to erase her very name from human memory, turning her story into a detective novel written in stone and sand? This is the story of Hatshepsut, the foremost of noble ladies who became pharaoh. A story of unprecedented ambition, brilliant propaganda, great achievements, and posthumous damnation. This is a journey into the very heart of the new kingdom, into a world where gods walked among mortals, and one woman dared to become equal to the gods. Before the star of Hatshepsut rose on the horizon of history, the land of Egypt itself had to experience a rebirth. For more than 100 years, the 2 lands, Upper and Lower, had been under the humiliating yoke of foreigners, Asiatic invaders known as the Hyksos. Their expulsion was not just a military victory, but a national trauma that gave birth to a new, aggressive ideology and a dynasty of warrior pharaohs, obsessed with the idea of empire and security. It was in this seething atmosphere of revenge, xenophobia, Senenmut, and religious fervor, as Egypt transformed from an insular river civilization into a world power, that the foundations for the unprecedented ascent of a woman to the throne of Horus were laid. To understand the phenomenon of Hatshepsut, one must immerse oneself in the world of Egypt's 18th dynasty, a world born of chaos and humiliation. About 100 years before her birth, around 1650 before Christ, Egypt endured one of the darkest periods in its history, known as the Second Intermediate Period. The power of the centralized government of the Middle Kingdom pharaohs weakened, and the country disintegrated. The Hyksos, a coalition of Semitic tribes from Western Asia, took advantage of this, using advanced military technologies that the Egyptians had never seen before, such as horse-drawn war chariots, composite bows, and new types of swords. They conquered the Nile Delta and established their capital, the city of Avaris. Their rulers proclaimed themselves pharaohs and controlled the north of the country, while in the south, in Thebes, the descendants of Egyptian kings took refuge, forced to pay tribute to the invaders. This was a time of deep national humiliation. For the Egyptians, whose worldview was built on the concept of ma'at, divine order, harmony, and truth, the rule of foreigners was a sacrilege, a violation of universal law. Their land, the sacred gift of the gods, was desecrated, and the pharaoh, the living embodiment of the god Horus, was powerless. This trauma left an indelible mark on their collective consciousness. The expulsion of the Hyksos became a national cause, a holy war waged by the Theban rulers of the 17th dynasty. King Senenmut, whose mutilated mummy with terrible wounds on its skull from a battle axe and daggers attests to his death in battle, began this struggle. His sons Thutmose and especially Amun-Ra completed it. Around 1550 before Christ, Thutmose, after a long and bloody war, stormed Avaris and expelled the last of the Hyksos from Egypt, pursuing them all the way to Palestine. This moment is considered the beginning of a new era, the era of the New Kingdom, and the foundation of the 18th dynasty, the most powerful and brilliant in all of Egypt's history. But the victory changed Egypt forever. The lesson learned from the Hyksos domination was simple. To guarantee security, one could not remain confined to the Nile Valley. The best defense is a good offense. Egypt had to create an empire, push its borders as far as possible, creating buffer zones in Nubia to the south and in Syria-Palestine to the north. Thus was born the new ideology of the warrior pharaoh. The ruler was now not just the guarantor of internal order and the mediator between humans and gods. He became the supreme commander-in-chief, a conqueror whose valor on the battlefield was the main proof of his divine right to the throne. Along with the new military doctrine, profound social and religious changes occurred. The army transformed from a temporary militia into a professional, permanent force, becoming a crucial social ladder. A common soldier could rise to high ranks and receive land, gold, and captives as a reward. The military aristocracy, hardened in the battles for liberation, became the new elite, pushing aside the old priestly and bureaucratic classes. A cult of the warrior hero emerged, and tales of battles and exploits became the main theme of official art. The main patron god of the Theban liberator kings was the local god Amun. After the victory, his cult merged with the ancient cult of the sun god Ra, and Amun-Ra was proclaimed king of the gods, the supreme deity of the entire empire. His main temple in Thebes, known as Karnak, began to transform into a grandiose religious complex, which was the main economic and political center of the country. The pharaohs generously endowed the temple with a portion of the spoils of war, land, and slaves. As a result, the priesthood of Amun-Ra, led by the high priest, concentrated colossal wealth and influence in its hands, becoming a force that even the pharaoh had to reckon with. In this struggle for liberation, the women of the Theban royal family, for example, Queen Ahotep and Queen Ahmose Nefertari, played an enormous role. They did not just govern the country while their husbands and sons were at war. They were the bearers of the purity of royal blood, symbols of national unity. To strengthen their status, an ancient title known as the god's wife of Amun was revived and filled with new content. The woman who held this title, usually the pharaoh's principal wife or his mother, was considered the earthly spouse of the supreme god. This gave her not only immense religious authority, but also control over a significant portion of the temple's wealth. This post would become one of the key steps on Hatshepsut's path to power. Ahmose's successors, Amenhotep I and Thutmose I, who was Hatshepsut's father, continued his policy of conquest. Thutmose I was one of the greatest warriors in Egypt's history. He expanded the empire to the south, reaching the fourth cataract of the Nile in Nubia, and made a daring campaign to the north, crossing the Euphrates River for the first time in history and erecting his victory stele there, challenging the powerful kingdom of Mitanni. The wealth that flooded into Egypt from conquered lands, such as gold from Nubia, timber from Lebanon, and tribute from Syrian cities, was incalculable. The capital, Thebes, turned into the most luxurious metropolis of the ancient world. It was into this turbulent, energetic, and ambitious era, in a world where weapons clanged, giant temples were built, and royal women were revered, that around 1508 before Christ, a girl was born to the family of the great Thutmose I and his principal wife, Queen Ahmose. She was given the name Hatshepsut, which meant foremost of noble ladies. No one at that time could have imagined that this princess would not be content with the traditional role of queen and God's wife, but would challenge the very world order, inscribing her name in history with golden hieroglyphs, not as the wife or mother of a king, but as the king himself. In the golden halls of the Theban palace, amidst the scents of lotus and incense, grew a girl in whose veins flowed the purest blood of the 18th dynasty. Her father was a god on earth, an invincible warrior Pharaoh, and her mother was the great royal wife, the bearer of the most ancient traditions. For her, it seemed, a most enviable but strictly defined destiny was prepared, to become the wife of her brother, to bear an heir, and to perform sacred rituals as the god's wife of Amun. But what if, from childhood, something greater lived in this princess? What if her father's tales of campaigns to the distant Euphrates ignited in her soul not reverence, but a thirst for her own achievements? Hatshepsut's path from princess to regent was paved not only with traditions but also with the first, still hidden from prying eyes, sparks of unprecedented ambition. Hatshepsut was born at the epicenter of power. Her father, Thutmose I, was a living legend. He was not the direct heir of the previous pharaoh, Amenhotep I, and probably came to power through his marriage to Princess Ahmose, who was the late king's sister and possibly the daughter of the dynasty's founder, Ahmose I. Thus it was Queen Ahmose who was the bearer of legitimacy, passing it on to her husband and children. This fact Hatshepsut learned well from childhood. That royal blood through the female line was of colossal importance. Hatshepsut's childhood was spent in luxury and under the shadow of great events. She saw caravans arriving in Thebes from Nubia and Asia with tribute, bringing gold, ivory, ebony, exotic animals, and captives. She heard tales of her father's victories which were immortalized on the walls of temples. She grew up in an atmosphere of triumph and boundless faith in Egypt's divine destiny. She received the best education available to a royal daughter. She could read and write, studied sacred texts, and mastered the complex rituals of court and temple life. Later, as Pharaoh, Hatshepsut would create a myth of her divine birth, which she would order to be carved on the walls of her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari. According to this legend, the god Amun-Ra himself, taking the form of her father, Thutmose I, came to her mother, Queen Ahmose, and conceived her. Then the creator god Khnum fashioned her body and her life force, known as the Ka, on a potter's wheel, and the goddess of wisdom Seshat foretold her great future. This story, of course, was political propaganda created in hindsight to strengthen her claim to the throne, but it reflected the special connection with the divine world that was attributed to her from birth. Thutmose I and Queen Ahmose besides Hatshepsut, had another daughter, Nefertiti, but she apparently died in youth. The principal royal couple had no sons. Male heirs, Amenmose and Wajmose, were born to Thutmose by secondary wives, but they also died during their father's lifetime. The pharaoh's only surviving son, born of a concubine named Mut-Nofret, was a boy also named Thutmose. It was he who became the heir to the throne. To ensure succession and preserve the purity of the royal blood, the only possible decision was made. Hatshepsut, daughter of the great royal wife, was to marry her half-brother Thutmose, son of the concubine. This marriage transferred to him the legitimacy that her blood carried. When her father, the great Thutmose I, died around 1493 before Christ, her husband ascended the throne as Thutmose II. Hatshepsut became the great royal wife. Her husband, Thutmose II, was the complete opposite of his warrior father. Judging by his mummy, he was a weak and sickly man suffering from some skin disease. His reign was short and not marked by any significant events. He conducted one small punitive campaign in Nubia to suppress a rebellion, but he most likely did not participate in it himself, entrusting the command to his generals. Otherwise, he continued his father's policy, but without his energy and scope. During this period, Hatshepsut performed all the roles befitting her status. She was the chief woman in the state, the mother of the heiress. She and Thutmose II had a daughter named Nefertiti. They apparently had no son and heir. Like his father, Thutmose II had to rely on offspring from other women. He had a son by a concubine named Iset, a tiny boy who, by family tradition, was also named Thutmose. In addition to her role as queen, Hatshepsut also held the most important religious title of God's wife of Amun. This position gave her not only a sacred status, but also real power. She participated in the most important temple rituals at Karnak, managed the priestesses, and had access to the temple's vast economic resources. She was not just the pharaoh's wife. She was the earthly embodiment of the goddess Mut, Amun's consort. This allowed her to establish close ties with the powerful priesthood of the Theban god, which would later become her main support. Even then, she began to position herself not just as an appendage to her pharaoh husband, but as an independent figure with a direct connection to the supreme deity. The reign of Thutmose II did not last long. According to various estimates, he sat on the throne for 3 to 13 years, but most Egyptologists lean towards a shorter term. Around 1479 before Christ, he died, and again Egypt found itself in a situation of dynastic uncertainty. The only male heir was a small child, the future Thutmose III, son of the late king by a secondary wife. According to Egyptian laws and traditions, in such a situation, the regent for a minor king should be the dowager queen, the heir's mother. But Thutmose III's mother, Iset, did not have a high status. Hatshepsut, however, the widow of the deceased pharaoh, his half-sister, the daughter of the great Thutmose I and the bearer of the purest royal blood, possessed unquestionable authority. It was she, not the boy's mother, who took the reins of government. Thus began her path to the pinnacle of power. At first, she was simply a regent ruling in the name of her stepson and nephew. She acted cautiously, observing all formalities, emphasizing that she was merely the guardian of the throne for the legitimate king. But all real power was already concentrated in her hands. And with each year of her rule, a plan daring and unheard of matured in the mind of this extraordinary woman. To cease being the shadow of a man and to become the light emanating from the throne of Horus herself. Power is like a drug. Once tasted, it is almost impossible to give up. For the first years of her regency, Hatshepsut acted as an exemplary dowager queen, wisely ruling the country in the name of the young Thutmose III. In all official depictions, she stood behind him, as a patron and protector. But under the cover of this traditional role lay cold calculation and a titanic effort to create a new image. How can you convince an entire country whose worldview was built on the immutability of traditions to accept the unthinkable, a woman as king? Hatshepsut's transformation from regent to pharaoh was not a coup d'etat in the usual sense, but a brilliant multi-move PR campaign played out on the stone walls of temples and in the sacred halls of the gods. The first few years of Hatshepsut's rule were marked by continuity. She governed the country relying on a group of loyal and influential officials whom she had known since her father's time. A key figure in her entourage was Hatshepsut, who combined the two most important positions, High Priest of Amun and Vizier, or Jati. Such a concentration of religious and secular power in one person's hands was unprecedented, and undoubtedly became possible only with her approval. Hatshepsut ensured her full support from the powerful priesthood of Karnak, which saw her as their protégé. Another crucial supporter was a man named Senenmut. His rise was truly meteoric. Coming from an obscure provincial family, he made a brilliant career, becoming Hatshepsut's chief confidant. He held dozens of titles, for example, steward of the House of Amun, chief architect, and tutor of the royal daughter Neferur. He was her right hand, responsible for all major projects and, as many believe, her favorite and possibly her lover. His loyalty and talents were invaluable to her. Meanwhile, young Thutmose III was formally considered king. He lived at court, received an education befitting a future ruler, and participated in some ceremonies. But real power was increasingly concentrated in his stepmother's hands. Hatshepsut gradually, step by step, changed her official image. Initially, she was depicted as a woman in traditional female attire, but already with some attributes of royal power. Then her titulary became more complex and sublime. She began to use epithets that were usually applied only to pharaohs. And finally, somewhere between the 2nd and 7th year of her regency, the decisive step was taken. Hatshepsut proclaimed herself co-ruler with Thutmose III and adopted the full royal titulary, consisting of 5 names. She became pharaoh. To justify this unheard-of act, a complex system of ideological justification was developed, a true theological doctrine which her supporters immortalized in stone. The main argument was that her accession was not her personal desire, but the direct command of the king of the gods, Amun-Ra. In Karnak and Deir el-Bahari, reliefs depicting the oracle of Amun were created. During a lavish temple procession, the statue of the god, carried on a sacred bark by priests, allegedly stopped before Hatshepsut and pointed to her as his chosen one. Thus, her power was sanctioned by the highest divine force, and to argue with it meant to argue with Amun himself. A myth of her conception by the god Amun was also created. This placed her above any other mortal claimant to the throne. She was not just a descendant of kings, she was the daughter of the king of the gods himself. Hatshepsut also claimed that her father, Thutmose III, had appointed her as his heir during his lifetime. On the walls of her temple are scenes where the elderly Thutmose presents her to the courtiers as the future ruler. Most historians consider this a fabrication, but for her contemporaries who revered the memory of the great conqueror, it was a weighty argument. The most striking aspect of this campaign was its iconography. Understanding that the image of a female ruler was alien to the Egyptian worldview, Hatshepsut took an unprecedented step. She ordered herself to be depicted as a man. In statues and reliefs, she appears with a male body, in male attire, that is, the short royal kilt, the shendit, with a ritual false beard and in royal crowns. Her inscriptions use masculine pronouns. She did not try to hide her gender. In texts, she is sometimes called the daughter of Ra, but her official, sacred image was masculine. She became not a queen, but a king. She did not occupy the throne. She herself became the throne, the embodiment of eternal and unchanging kingship, which by its nature could only be male. This does not mean that Thutmose III was completely sidelined or humiliated. He remained co-ruler. On many reliefs they are depicted together, although Hatshepsut always occupies the dominant position. She leads the ceremony, she recites the main formulas, she is closer to the deity. Thutmose III follows her like a diligent student behind a teacher. His role is auxiliary. In reality, his position was extremely ambiguous. On the one hand, he was king. His name was inscribed in cartouches. He was paid homage. Hatshepsut never formally stripped him of his status. This was a wise political move, as the elimination or humiliation of the legitimate heir could have provoked a rebellion by the army or court factions. By keeping him as a junior partner, she maintained the appearance of legitimacy and continuity. On the other hand, he was completely removed from the real administration of the state. Domestic policy, finance, construction, religion, all were under the control of Hatshepsut and her confidants like Senenmut and Hapuseneb. The young king was assigned one sphere in which he could prove himself and which was considered appropriate for a man of his rank: the army. Hatshepsut, being a woman, could not personally lead military campaigns. This would have contradicted all conceptions of Ma'at, the divine order. Therefore, Thutmose III remained the nominal commander-in-chief. His childhood and youth were spent among soldiers. He studied military affairs, learned to wield weapons, shoot a bow, and drive a chariot. He grew up not in the palace among priests and officials, but in the barracks, surrounded by veterans of his grandfather Thutmose I's campaigns. This had two important consequences. First, he grew up strong, resilient, and perfectly prepared for the role of warrior pharaoh that he was destined to become. Second, he won the loyalty and respect of the army. The soldiers and officers saw him as one of their own, the direct heir of the great conquerors, and perhaps eagerly awaited the day when he would lead them on real, not training, campaigns. The army probably became the force that supported him and prevented him from being completely pushed aside from power. During Hatshepsut's reign, Egypt conducted only a few small military campaigns. Minor rebellions in Nubia were suppressed, and one or two small raids were made into Palestine. It is possible that the young Thutmose led these operations. But these were not the great wars of conquest that his ancestors had waged. Hatshepsut's foreign policy was predominantly peaceful. How did Thutmose feel about this? The sources are silent. We can only speculate based on his subsequent actions. According to the theory of patient waiting, Thutmose was a pragmatist. He understood that Hatshepsut was too strong and any move against her would be suicidal. He accepted the rules of the game and patiently waited for her death, preparing for his own reign. His time in the army was an ideal opportunity for him to gain experience and build a base of support. Another viewpoint suggests that he was deeply humiliated by his position. To see a woman occupy his throne, wear his titles, and rule in his name was unbearable for him. Every new obelisk, every new temple glorifying Hatshepsut was a reminder of his own powerlessness. This theory well explains his subsequent actions to destroy her memory, as it was revenge for 2 decades of humiliation. Perhaps their relationship was more complex than simple enmity or submission. It is possible that some semblance of respect or even affection existed between the stepmother and stepson. Hatshepsut gave him the best military education and preserved his life and status. He, in turn, ensured the loyalty of the army and protected the borders. It was a kind of political symbiosis, beneficial to both sides. Marriage played an important role in his fate. Hatshepsut, to bind him even more closely to her family, married him to her daughter by Thutmose II, Princess Neferure. Thus, Thutmose III became his stepmother's son-in-law. This marriage was intended to ensure a smooth transition of power and unite the two branches of the dynasty. However, as we know, Neferur apparently died young and this plan collapsed. The years passed. Thutmose grew from a boy into a man, then into a mature warrior. He was married, had children, including his future heir Amenhotep II, and Hatshepsut was growing old, and the longer he waited, the stronger it must be assumed his impatience became. The whole country, and especially the army, looked to him. He was the future of Egypt. The shadow on the throne was preparing to become the sun itself. The greatness of a pharaoh in ancient Egypt was measured not only by the height of his obelisks, but also by the breadth of his construction. Stone was the eternal language in which kings conducted a dialogue with the gods and with posterity, and Hatshepsut, the female pharaoh deprived of the opportunity to glorify herself through great conquests, chose precisely this language to assert her legitimacy and leave an indelible mark on history. Her reign became a true renaissance in architecture and art. From the giant obelisks piercing the heavens at Karnak to the jewel of her reign, the terraced temple at Deir el-Bahari, her buildings were not just structures. They were stone manifestos of her power, theological treatises and autobiographies designed to forever convince the world that the rule of a woman was not a violation but the highest expression of divine order. Having become the full-fledged pharaoh, Hatshepsut launched construction activity on a scale that Egypt had not seen since the time of the builders of the Great Pyramids at Giza. Her goal was not simply to erect new buildings, but a comprehensive program that pursued several objectives: to glorify the gods, primarily her patron Amun-Ra, to provide work for thousands of people, to demonstrate the wealth and prosperity of the country, and of course, to immortalize her own name and legitimize her rule. Her chief architect and executor of all her plans was her faithful associate, Senenmut. The main focus of her attention was the Karnak temple, the religious heart of Egypt. She did not just add new elements to the existing complex, she rebuilt it with imperial scope. Her most famous contribution to Karnak was 2 giant obelisks of pink Aswan granite, nearly 30 meters high each. They were the tallest in Egypt at that time. Their quarrying, transportation down the Nile on huge barges, and erection were marvels of engineering. In the inscriptions on the obelisks, Hatshepsut proudly reports that the work took only 7 months. Their tops, or pyramidions, were covered with electrum, an alloy of gold and silver, and shone in the sun, visible for many kilometers. One of these obelisks still stands at Karnak. The other lies broken nearby. She placed them between the pylons built by her father, as if weaving herself into the fabric of her dynasty's history. Another of her masterpieces was the so-called Red Chapel, or Red Sanctuary. It was an exquisite structure of red quartzite and black granite, intended for the sacred bark of Amun. The chapel's walls were covered with the finest reliefs, depicting Hatshepsut herself in male guise and Thutmose III making offerings to the gods. These reliefs are an invaluable source of information about the religious rituals of that time. Later, during the persecution of her memory, the chapel was dismantled, and its blocks were used as filler for the construction of Amenhotep III's pylon. In the 20th century, archaeologists performed a miracle, literally assembling this puzzle from hundreds of blocks and restoring the chapel to its original form. She also began the construction of a new 8th pylon, which extended the temple to the south, creating a new processional way to the temple of the goddess Mut. But the main architectural achievement in the work of her life was the construction of her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari, on the west bank of the Nile opposite Karnak. The temple was named Djeser-Djeseru, meaning Holy of Holies. The site was not chosen by chance. The temple adjoined a rocky amphitheater that was anciently revered as a sanctuary of the goddess Hathor and was located next to the mortuary temple of the great Middle Kingdom pharaoh Mentuhotep-Tsu, the unifier of Egypt. Thus, Hatshepsut once again placed herself in the same rank as the greatest rulers of the past. The temple's design, developed by Senenmut, was absolutely brilliant and innovative. Instead of building a massive enclosed structure, the architect created an open, harmonious ensemble that did not dominate the surrounding landscape but merged with it. The temple consists of 3 huge terraces rising in steps to the foot of the sheer cliffs. Wide ramps connect the terraces, creating a majestic processional way. The colonnades framing the terraces with their vertical lines echo the structure of the cliffs, creating a sense of unity between nature and architecture. In ancient times, the terraces were adorned with gardens of exotic trees and pools, turning the place into a true paradise. But Djeser-Djeseru was not just a beautiful building. It was a stone book telling the story of Hatshepsut as she wanted it to be remembered. The temple walls are covered with thousands of square meters of reliefs of the highest artistic quality. For example, the portico of divine birth details the story of her conception by the god Amun, her birth, and her recognition by the gods. This was her main proof of her right to the throne. Perhaps the most famous part of the temple is the Punt portico. Here her greatest peaceful mission is depicted, a sea expedition to the mysterious land of Punt. This land, scholars believe, was located on the coast of modern Somalia or Eritrea. The reliefs with documentary accuracy show Egyptian ships there loading, the meeting with the ruler of Punt and his wife, and the exotic flora and fauna of this distant land. We see the Egyptians bringing back immense treasures such as myrrh trees with their roots for planting in the temple gardens, frankincense, ebony, ivory, gold, leopard skins, pet monkeys, and even live cheetahs. This expedition was presented as a great achievement, carried out at the direct command of Amun, and was a triumph of diplomacy and trade, not war. The temple also contained sanctuaries dedicated to gods closely associated with kingship and the afterlife, namely Amun-Ra, the god of the dead Anubis, and the goddess of the west, Hathor, who was depicted as a sacred cow. The temple of Djeser-Djeseru was the pinnacle of New Kingdom architectural thought and had a huge influence on the subsequent development of Egyptian architecture. It was a daring and beautiful assertion of power, built by a woman who ruled as a man. In addition to these 2 main centers, Hatshepsut carried out construction throughout Egypt and in Nubia. She restored temples that, according to her, had fallen into disrepair during the Hyksos period, thereby positioning herself as a restorer of order and piety. From Buhen in Nubia to Beni Hassan in Middle Egypt, traces of her activity remain everywhere. She was not just a ruler, she was a builder pharaoh, and her stone legacy, despite all attempts to destroy it, proved more durable than the memory of her persecutors. Behind every great ruler there is often an equally outstanding figure who remains in the shadow of the throne. For Hatshepsut, that person was Senenmut. Architect, official, tutor, he was her shadow, her right hand, her most trusted confidant. His rise was as swift and unprecedented as his mistress's accession. Their connection was so close and his privileges so exceptional that for centuries they have given rise to bold rumors and speculation. Was their relationship merely a political alliance between a ruler and her loyal minister? Or did a deep personal affection, perhaps even love that defied court conventions, hide behind the cold hieroglyphs of official titles? The story of Senenmut is a key not only to understanding the mechanisms of power under Hatshepsut, but also to unraveling the mystery of the female pharaoh's own heart. Senenmut's story is a classic success story embodied in the realities of ancient Egypt. He did not belong to the high Theban aristocracy. His parents, Ramose and Hatnefer, were modest provincials from the town of Armagh. We know this because Senenmut, having reached the pinnacle of power, took care of his parents and prepared a worthy tomb for them near his own, in which archaeologists discovered their untouched sarcophagi. Senenmut probably began his career as a soldier in the army of Hatshepsut's father, Thutmose I. Having shown ability, he transferred to state service and gradually rose through the ranks. But his real ascent began when Hatshepsut became regent. She saw in this energetic and talented man someone she could rely on. She showered him with offices and titles, of which, according to Egyptologists, he had more than 80. He was steward of the double granary, which gave him control over the country's food resources. He was chief of all the king's works, making him responsible for the grandiose construction program, including the erection of obelisks at Karnak and the masterpiece at Deir el-Bahari. He was steward of the house of the royal daughter Neferure, that is, her official guardian and tutor. He was steward of the house of Amun, controlling the vast wealth and estates of the country's main temple. In fact, finance, construction, and the education of the heiress, the key levers of state control, were concentrated in his hands. His influence was enormous. He was not just an executor, but most likely a co-author of many of Hatshepsut's ideas and projects. His name and image appear in the most unexpected and sacred places, which testifies to his exceptional status. Senenmut received from Hatshepsut the unheard-of privilege of placing his images and inscriptions in her mortuary temple. In hidden niches behind doors, he ordered his statues and prayers to the gods to be carved. This was a daring violation of all canons, according to which no one but the king himself and the gods could be depicted in the king's temple. He built for himself 2 magnificent tombs. One, Theban Tomb 71, was located on the hill of Sheikh Abdel-Qurna. Among the tombs of other nobles, the second, Theban Tomb 353, was unique. It was located directly under the first terrace of Hatshepsut's temple at Deir el-Bahari. No official before or after him was honored with burial on the grounds of a royal mortuary temple. This tomb is also notable for its ceiling, on which the oldest known Egyptian astronomical map is depicted. More than 20 statues depicting Senenmut with the young princess Neferure, Hatshepsut's daughter, have survived. These sculptures are striking in their tenderness and originality. In some, he is seated, holding the girl on his lap. In the most unusual ones, the so-called block statues, he is depicted as a cubic figure wrapped in a cloak, from under which only the princess's head peeks out, whom he, as it were, protects with his entire being. These images emphasize his role as the heiress's mentor and protector. In an abandoned quarry near Deir el-Bahari, a crudely scratched graffito was found depicting a man in priestly robes and a woman in a pharaoh's crown engaged in an intimate act. Although there is no direct proof, many researchers see in this caricature, probably made by one of the workers, a hint of a love affair between Senenmut and Hatshepsut. The central figure in Hatshepsut's plans was her only daughter, Neferure. From the very beginning, the mother prepared a special role for her. Neferure bore the titles royal daughter and great royal wife, although she was not formally married. Most importantly, Hatshepsut passed on to her her own former title, namely God's Wife of Amun. This made Neferure the most influential priestess in the country. Perhaps Hatshepsut saw her daughter as her heir. She may have planned to marry her to Thutmose III, further strengthening her branch of the dynasty, or even prepared the ground for creating a precedent for the transfer of power from a female pharaoh to another woman. Senenmut's role as Neferure's tutor and guardian was key in this context. He was to prepare the princess for her great destiny. However, somewhere in the 16th or 19th year of Hatshepsut's reign, Senenmut's star suddenly set. His name ceases to be mentioned in official chronicles. His images in the temple at Deir el-Bahari were partially damaged, though not as systematically as Hatshepsut's own images would later be. His tombs were never used for burial and remained unfinished. What happened to him? The versions differ. Perhaps he died a natural death. Perhaps he fell out of favor, having become too influential and provoking the jealousy of his patroness. Some believe he was a victim of intrigues by the growing party of Thutmose III's supporters. The fate of Neferure is also obscure. She too disappears from the pages of history at about the same time. Most likely she died before reaching adulthood. Her death must have been a terrible blow to Hatshepsut and shattered all her dynastic plans. The story of Senenmut and Neferure adds a human dimension to Hatshepsut's reign. It shows that behind the majestic facade of the pharaoh was a woman who perhaps loved, trusted, and made plans for her daughter's future. The disappearance of these two key figures was probably the beginning of the decline of her brilliant reign and a harbinger of changes to come. A pharaoh's greatness was measured not only by the height of his obelisks, but also by the breadth of his horizons. While her ancestors and successors sought glory in bloody battles to the north, Hatshepsut turned her gaze southward, to the mysterious and fabulously rich land that the Egyptians called Punt, or the God's Land. She equipped not a military but a trading expedition, which became one of the most celebrated deeds of her era. This was not just a journey for exotic goods. It was a demonstration of power, prosperity, and divine patronage. The story of the expedition to Punt, captured in vivid detail on the walls of her temple, is a hymn to peace, diplomacy, and curiosity, a unique page in the annals of the New Kingdom's predominantly military triumphs. In the 9th year of her reign, around 1470 before Christ, Hatshepsut, as the inscriptions at Deir el-Bahari state, received a direct command from the oracle of the god Amun. The god wished for the routes to Punt to be explored and for myrrh trees to be brought from there to adorn the terraces of his temple. Myrrh and frankincense were sacred incenses to the Egyptians, called the sweat of the gods, without which no temple ritual was complete. Their delivery was a matter of state importance. Expeditions to Punt had been made before, even since the Old Kingdom, but over time this route had fallen into disuse. Hatshepsut decided to revive it on an unprecedented scale. The exact location of Punt is still a matter of debate, but most scholars agree that it was on the coast of the Red Sea, in the territory of modern Eritrea, Djibouti, or Somalia, and possibly part of Sudan. Preparations for the expedition were massive. On the coast of the Red Sea, at a port probably located near modern Wadi el-Jarf, 5 large seagoing ships were built or assembled. Each ship was about 21 meters long, with 1 large mast and sail, as well as oars for maneuvering. The flotilla was commanded by a nobleman named Nahesi. The reliefs at Deir el-Bahari illustrate the entire journey in detail. We see soldiers and sailors loading trade goods onto the ships, such as beads, axes, daggers, and other products of Egyptian craftsmen. Then the fleet set sail on the Red Sea. The journey was long and undoubtedly dangerous. The Egyptians' arrival in Punt is depicted as a peaceful and friendly meeting. The local people come out to meet them. The reliefs with ethnographic accuracy convey their appearance. Dark-skinned people with curly hair, men with pointed beards wearing loincloths. Their huts built on stilts resemble beehives. The Egyptian delegation is met by the ruler of Punt, named Pharaoh, and his wife, Queen Ati. The depiction of the queen is particularly noteworthy as she is shown as a very large woman with disproportionately large fat deposits, which may have been a sign of wealth and fertility in her culture, or evidence of some medical condition. The Egyptians set up a camp on the shore and host a feast for the Puntites, offering them bread, beer, and wine. A lively exchange takes place. In return for their goods, the Egyptians received the immense riches of Punt. The artists lovingly depict mountains of incense, ebony, ivory, gold, electrum, leopard skins, and live monkeys, which the sailors drag onto the ships. But the main goal of the expedition was the myrrh trees. The reliefs show workers carefully digging up 31 trees with their roots and soil, placing them in special baskets and loading them onto the ships. This was the first known attempt in history to transport and acclimatize foreign trees. The return of the expedition to Thebes became a national triumph. Hatshepsut personally meets the flotilla. The treasures of Punt are weighed and counted in the presence of officials. Then she holds a grand ceremony at the temple of Amun, dedicating the brought gifts to him. The culmination is the planting of the myrrh trees on the terraces of her temple at Deir el-Bahari. An inscription states that she made for Amun a Punt in his own garden in Thebes. The significance of this expedition can hardly be overstated. It was an ideological triumph. The expedition was presented not as a simple commercial enterprise, but as the fulfillment of divine will. The success of the mission proved that Hatshepsut enjoyed Amun's favor, and this was a powerful argument for her legitimacy. She brought the god what no pharaoh before her could. It was also an economic benefit. Egypt gained access to strategically important resources, primarily incense, which was necessary for temple cults throughout the country. The resumption of trade with Punt undoubtedly enriched the state treasury. Furthermore, the expedition had scientific and cultural significance. The Egyptians expanded their geographical knowledge, established diplomatic contacts with a distant land, and brought back samples of foreign flora and fauna. The reliefs at Deir el-Bahari are an invaluable source of information about the nature and inhabitants of ancient Punt. And finally, it was propaganda for peace. In an era when pharaohs glorified themselves mainly through military victories and the number of enemies killed, Hatshepsut made a peaceful mission the central event of her reign. She showed that Egypt's greatness could be manifested not only in the strength of its arms, but also in the power of its fleet, the art of its diplomats, and the richness of its culture. The expedition to Punt became the hallmark of her reign. It demonstrated to the world and to her subjects that under her leadership, Egypt was prospering and the gods were favorable. It was a masterpiece of political propaganda, and at the same time a real achievement that inscribed Hatshepsut's name in history for centuries as the ruler who brought the wonders of the gods' land to the Nile Valley. For 22 years, while Hatshepsut built temples and sent expeditions, the legitimate heir, Thutmose III, grew and matured in her shadow. On official reliefs, he was depicted as a submissive junior co-ruler, standing behind his all-powerful stepmother. But what was really going on in this young man's soul? What was it like to hold the title of pharaoh but have no real power? Was he a will-less puppet or an ambitious prince who patiently waited for his moment, clenching his fists and harboring a grudge? The silence of Thutmose III during Hatshepsut's reign is one of the most intriguing mysteries of Egyptian history. The answer to it, perhaps, lies in the fury with which his name would be carved on battlefields, and in the cold determination with which his stepmother's name would be scraped from the walls of temples. Hatshepsut's official propaganda created a picture of complete harmony between the two co-rulers. On the reliefs of the Red Chapel at Karnak, they are often depicted together, performing rituals before the gods. However, Hatshepsut, as the senior pharaoh, always occupies the dominant position. It is she who leads the ceremony, recites the main formulas, and is closer to the deity. Thutmose III follows her, like a diligent student behind a teacher. His role is auxiliary. In reality, his position was extremely ambiguous. On the one hand, he was king. His name was inscribed in cartouches. He was paid homage. Hatshepsut never formally stripped him of his status. This was a wise political move, as the elimination or humiliation of the legitimate heir could have provoked a rebellion by the army or court factions. By keeping him as a junior partner, she maintained the appearance of legitimacy and continuity. On the other hand, he was completely removed from the real administration of the state. Domestic policy, finance, construction, religion, all were under the control of Hatshepsut and her confidants, like Senenmut and Hatshepsut. The young king was assigned one sphere in which he could prove himself, and which was considered appropriate for a man of his rank, the army. Hatshepsut, being a woman, could not personally lead military campaigns. This would have contradicted all conceptions of Mayat, the divine order. Therefore, Thutmose III remained the nominal commander-in-chief. His childhood and youth were spent among soldiers. He studied military affairs, learned to wield weapons, shoot a bow, and drive a chariot. He grew up not in the palace, among priests and officials, but in the barracks, surrounded by veterans of his grandfather Thutmose I's campaigns. This had two important consequences. First, he grew up strong, resilient, and perfectly prepared for the role of warrior pharaoh that he was destined to become. Second, he won the loyalty and respect of the army. The soldiers and officers saw him as one of their own, the direct heir of the great conquerors, and perhaps eagerly awaited the day when he would lead them on real, not training, campaigns. The army probably became the force that supported him and prevented him from being completely pushed aside from power. During Hatshepsut's reign, Egypt conducted only a few small military campaigns. Minor rebellions in Nubia were suppressed, and one or two small raids were made into Palestine. It is possible that the young Thutmose led these operations. But these were not the great wars of conquest that his ancestors had waged. Hatshepsut's foreign policy was predominantly peaceful. How did Thutmose feel about this? The sources are silent. We can only speculate based on his subsequent actions. According to the theory of patient waiting, Thutmose was a pragmatist. He understood that Hatshepsut was too strong and any move against her would be suicidal. He accepted the rules of the game and patiently waited for her death. Preparing for his own reign, his time in the army was an ideal opportunity for him to gain experience and build a base of support. Another viewpoint suggests that he was deeply humiliated by his position. To see a woman occupy his throne, wear his titles, and rule in his name was unbearable for him. Every new obelisk, every new temple glorifying Hatshepsut was a reminder of his own powerlessness. This theory well explains his subsequent actions to destroy her memory, as it was revenge for 2 decades of humiliation. Perhaps their relationship was more complex than simple enmity or submission. It is possible that some semblance of respect or even affection existed between the stepmother and stepson. Hatshepsut gave him the best military education and preserved his life and status. He, in turn, ensured the loyalty of the army and protected the borders. It was a kind of political symbiosis beneficial to both sides. Marriage played an important role in his fate. Hatshepsut, to bind him even more closely to her family, married him to her daughter by Thutmose II, Princess Neferur. Thus Thutmose III became his stepmother's son-in-law. This marriage was intended to ensure a smooth transition of power and unite the 2 branches of the dynasty. However, as we know, Neferur apparently died young, and this plan collapsed. The years passed. Thutmose grew from a boy into a man, then into a mature warrior. He was married, had children, including his future heir, Amenhotep II. And Hatshepsut was growing old, and the longer he waited, the stronger it must be assumed his impatience became. The whole country, and especially the army, looked to him. He was the future of Egypt. The shadow on the throne was preparing to become the sun itself. Every life, even that of a pharaoh, is like the sun's path across the sky. For after the bright zenith, sunset is inevitable. In the 22nd year of her brilliant reign, Hatshepsut, the woman who became king, reached the end of her earthly journey. Her death is shrouded in mystery like many other aspects of her biography, but an even greater mystery awaited her beyond the threshold of eternity. Years after her passing, when her stepson was firmly seated on the throne, a campaign to totally destroy her memory began throughout Egypt. Her names were erased, her statues were smashed, and her image was carved out from the walls of temples. This was not just barbarism, it was a deliberate state policy of memory damnation known as Damnatio Memoriae. What was the cause of this posthumous war? Was it the personal revenge of Thutmose III, a cold political calculation, or an attempt to restore a disturbed world order? The mystery of Hatshepsut's erasure is the final, most dramatic act of her story. Around 1458 before Christ, in the 22nd year of her reign, Hatshepsut died. She was about 50 years old. The cause of her death remained unknown for a long time. However, in 2007, Egyptian archaeologists led by Zahi Hawass announced that they had managed to identify her mummy. It was the mummy of an elderly, obese woman found back in 1903 by Howard Carter in the modest Tomb 60 of the Valley of the Kings, which had long remained anonymous. Identification was made possible by a broken tooth found in a canopic box with her name on it, which perfectly matched an empty socket in the mummy's jaw. The study of the mummy shed light on the last years of her life. She suffered from diabetes, arthritis, and most importantly, bone cancer, which was likely the cause of her death. So she most likely died a natural death, and was not murdered, as some romantically minded historians had suggested. The transition of power to Thutmose III, who was by then in his 30s, seems to have been smooth. No evidence of turmoil or power struggles has survived. He was the legitimate king who had been waiting for this moment for many years. For the first few years of his sole reign, he seemed to respect his stepmother's memory. He even completed some of her construction projects. And then, about 2 years after her death, or according to another, more common version, towards the end of his own long reign, he began a war. But not with living enemies, but with a dead woman. Throughout Egypt, teams of stonemasons set to work. Their task was to erase Hatshepsut from history. Her name in cartouches on the walls of temples and on obelisks was systematically chiseled out. In its place, the names of her father, Thutmose I, her husband, Thutmose II, or Thutmose III himself were inscribed. This was done to create the appearance of an uninterrupted male line of rule. Her figures on reliefs were recarved into images of male pharaohs or simply hacked away. Her temple at Deir el-Bahari suffered particularly badly. Thousands of her statues were smashed and thrown into pits. It is thanks to this barbaric act that many of them, albeit in a broken state, have come down to us. If they had not been hidden, they would most likely have been burned for lime. This was done with incredible thoroughness. However, the persecutors could not destroy everything. Some images located too high or in dark, hard-to-reach places survived, and most importantly, they did not touch her tomb. According to Egyptian beliefs, destroying the name and body in the tomb condemned the soul to final annihilation, and Thutmose apparently did not dare to take such a step. Why did he do it? The motives for this act are still debated. The simplest and most obvious version is personal revenge. Thutmose III was avenging 2 decades of humiliation and waiting. Having become the sole ruler and glorified himself as the greatest conqueror in Egyptian history, often called the Napoleon of ancient Egypt, he decided to erase from history the one who had so long overshadowed him. A more convincing theory is that of political necessity. The reign of a female pharaoh was an anomaly, a violation of the fundamental principles of Ma'at. It created a dangerous precedent. Any ambitious queen in the future could cite Hatshepsut's example to seize the throne. By destroying her memory, Thutmose III was not so much taking revenge on a person as eradicating the very idea that a woman could be king. He was restoring the traditional patriarchal order and ensuring the stability of the dynasty. The fact that the persecution began not immediately but years later may indicate that it was not an emotional impulse but a cold political calculation, undertaken perhaps towards the end of his life to ensure a smooth transition of power to his son Amenhotep. It is also possible that the destruction was aimed not so much against Hatshepsut herself as against her party and her associates, primarily Senenmut. By erasing her from official history, Thutmose III definitively asserted his own line as the only legitimate one. Whatever the case, the memory damnation worked. For 3,000 years, Hatshepsut's name was virtually forgotten. She became a lost pharaoh. Only in the 19th century, when Jean-François Champollion deciphered the hieroglyphs, did Egyptologists begin to piece together this incredible puzzle. They were surprised to find that behind the erased names of male pharaohs lay the name of a woman. Thus, 3 millennia after her death, Hatshepsut won her final victory over her persecutors. Her story was restored. The broken statues were glued together, the damaged reliefs were studied, and her mummy was found. The woman who was to be erased from eternity returned to take her rightful place in the pantheon of the greatest rulers of ancient Egypt. The curtain fell on Hatshepsut's life, and a long night of oblivion ensued. For 30 centuries, her name was but a whisper among the ruins, a mystery that even those who walked the land where her majestic temples once stood could not solve. Thutmose III and his successors almost succeeded. They turned her into an empty space in the long list of kings, a historical anomaly about which official chronicles like the famous Abydos king list were silent. In it, there is no gap between Thutmose I and Thutmose III. But stone proved more durable than human malice, and the curiosity of a new age proved stronger than ancient curses. The revival of Hatshepsut began in the 19th century, in the era of great archaeological discoveries. Scholars deciphering the inscriptions at Karnak and Deir el-Bahari were faced with the inexplicable. They saw images of a male pharaoh, but the grammar of the inscriptions sometimes betrayed a switch to the feminine gender. They saw cartouches where one name had been scraped away and another written over it. Step by step, like the greatest detectives, Egyptologists from Champollion to Karl Lepsius and Edouard Naville restored the truth. They realized there had been a woman who ruled as king, and that her memory had been targeted for destruction. The 20th century brought new, stunning discoveries. The excavations of Herbert Winlock at Deir el-Bahari in the 1920s revealed to the world thousands of fragments of her smashed statues, which today are the pride of many museums around the world, including the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York and the Cairo Museum. The restoration of the Red Chapel at Karnak, assembled from blocks like a giant puzzle, returned to us one of the masterpieces of her reign. And finally, in the early 21st century, thanks to the development of technologies such as computed tomography and DNA analysis, her mummy was identified. The nameless pharaoh had found her body. We can look at her face and know that she died an elderly woman from cancer, not from an assassin's dagger. What then is Hatshepsut's legacy today? It is multifaceted and contradictory, like her story itself. On the one hand, she was a usurper who violated sacred traditions. Her rise to power, though bloodless, was a revolution that was eventually suppressed, and its precedent was burned from historical memory. Her reign, however peaceful and prosperous, interrupted the line of warrior pharaohs, which was perhaps perceived by her successors as a period of weakness that needed to be compensated for with new, even more ferocious conquests. On the other hand, Hatshepsut appears to us as one of the most successful and effective rulers in Egypt's history. Her 22-year reign was an era of stability, economic prosperity, and cultural flourishing. She was not a warrior, but a builder, a diplomat, and an organizer. Her architectural masterpieces still evoke admiration, and the expedition to Punt remains a model of peaceful exploration and international trade. In the modern world, her story has acquired a new resonance. She has become a feminist icon, a symbol of a strong woman who fought her way to the pinnacle of power in a strictly male world. Her story proves that gender is no obstacle to brilliant leadership. She used all available tools such as propaganda, religion, and alliances to achieve her goal, and ruled wisely and with foresight. The story of Hatshepsut is ultimately a story about power and memory. It shows that history is not only what happened, but also how what happened is told. The victors write history, and Thutmose III, the great conqueror, almost succeeded in writing his version where there was no place for his stepmother. But he underestimated the durability of granite and the power of human curiosity. The return of Hatshepsut from oblivion is a triumph of archaeology and a reminder that the past never truly dies. It merely slumbers beneath the sands, waiting for the hour when new generations will ask new questions and hear the answers that were silenced for millennia. The story of the woman who became king has finally been told, and it turned out to be far more majestic and complex than even those who so desperately tried to erase it could ever have imagined.